A wounded drifter knocked on the widow's door at dawn. He wasn't who he claimed. The door is still there. I walk past it sometimes when the light is like it was that morning, gray and cold, the sun not yet over the ridge, frost on the porch boards. I look at that door and I think about the man who knocked on it and what he was carrying and what he was running from. And I think about her standing in it. The width of her shoulders, the lamp she was holding, the way she looked at me, the way no one had looked at me in a long, long time. That man was me. I'm going to tell you what happened best I can. Not all of it makes me proud. Some of it I've never said out loud to another soul. But a man gets to a point, and I'm past that point now, where he'd rather speak true than carry it. So, here it is. My name is Cal Devereaux. That's the name I was born with and the name I gave her. But when I knocked on that door in the gray of the morning in October of 1873, the name I was going by was James Cole. Had been going by that name for about 14 months. There are reasons for that. I'll get to them. I've been riding 3 days with a bullet in my side. Not deep enough to keep me honest. It had gone in at an angle under my lower left ribs, and I dug out what I could reach by feel the first night, propped against a cottonwood with a fire barely going. My own knife doing work I don't like to remember. What I couldn't reach had stayed. The muscle around it was hot and starting to swell. I could feel it when I breathed, not pain exactly, more like a pressure. Like something in there that wasn't supposed to be there was making its opinion known. I'd been heading for Harristown. Thought I might find a doctor there who wouldn't ask. The kind of town that had those in those days. But I'd gone wrong somewhere in the dark. The fever had come up by the second night and I wasn't reading the stars right. And I'd ended up following a creek northeast when I should have been going northwest. And by the third morning I was nowhere I recognized. And my horse was done. And I was done too if I'm being straight about it. The ranch came up out of the mist. You know that hour just before the sun, everything is blue and still and the shapes of things are just shapes. No color yet, no certainty. The fence posts looked like men standing. The barn was big and dark. The house had one window with lamplight in it, just one, yellow and steady, and I looked at that window the way a drowning man looks at a rope. I didn't think about whether it was wise, didn't think about much of anything except that light. I got off the horse. That was a project. I had to think each part of it through like I was learning it fresh. Left foot out, weight on the right, reach for the saddle horn. Down, don't fall, stand, walk. I walked to the door and I knocked. She didn't answer right away. I heard movement inside. I heard something, a drawer maybe or a box, and then quiet and then the steps. She wasn't in a hurry. I remember thinking that. Most folks, a knock at that hour, they'd either ignore it or scramble. She just walked to the door with a steady step, and she opened it, and she looked at me. She was holding the lamp in her left hand. Her right hand was not visible. I found out later she had a Colt's revolver in that hand, held down at her hip, and she was entirely ready to use it. She wasn't young, wasn't old, maybe 10 years younger than me, which would have put her around 41. Dark hair going silver at the temples, loose, hadn't been put up yet for the day. Brown eyes, a face that had seen weather and work and probably grief, the kind of face that doesn't carry softness as its default but isn't hard either. Just awake, clear. She looked at me, the way you look at a problem you're trying to decide whether to solve. I said, I'm James Cole. I've had a riding accident. I apologize for the hour. She said, you're bleeding through your coat. I said, yes, ma'am, I am. She said, that's not a riding accident. I said, no, ma'am, it's not. She stood there, lamp in one hand, gun in the other, looking at me, and I want to tell you I wasn't scared of her. I was tired. I was so bone-deep tired, not just from the fever and the 3 days and the bullet, tired from the 14 months of being James Cole, tired from the 6 years before that I'd spent becoming the kind of man who needed a different name. And standing there in that cold blue light with this woman looking at me like she already knew I was lying about the riding accident and suspected I might be lying about the name. I felt something I hadn't felt since I couldn't say when. I felt seen. Isn't that something? A dying man's vanity, maybe, but there it was. She said, "Can you walk?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then come in." Her name was Ruth Calloway. She'd been widowed 3 years. Her husband Thomas had died of a fever different from mine, the lung kind, the slow kind, leaving her with 400 acres of decent grassland, 120 head of cattle, a barn that needed repairing, and 2 ranch hands who stayed the first winter out of loyalty and left in the spring because they had to. She'd been running it herself since May. It was October. She looked like it. She put me in the small bedroom off the kitchen, the one her ranch hands had used. Narrow bed, low ceiling, a hook on the wall for a coat, a window looking east. She told me to sit on the bed and take my coat off, and she'd be right back. She wasn't asking. She came back with hot water in a basin, a lamp, scissors, and a small tin box that turned out to have the kind of things in it you learn to keep when you live 40 miles from the nearest doctor. Needle and thread, carbolic, strips of boiled linen. She'd done this before. Not on a bullet wound, she told me that plainly, but she'd sewn up a ranch hand who'd been caught by a harrow tine, and she'd taken a bone shard out of her husband's hand after a saw accident, and she knew enough not to panic. She cut my shirt away from the wound and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. I could feel her fingers pressing around the edges, careful, reading what was in there by touch. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. She said, "There's still something in there." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to have to go after it." I said, "I know that too." She said, "This is going to hurt." I said, "It already hurts." She almost smiled at that, not quite, but almost. What followed was about 20 minutes that I would not choose to repeat. She worked slow and steady, no flinching, one hand braced against my ribs and the other working with a thin probe she'd heated in the lamp flame. I made some sounds I'm not proud of. I gripped the iron of the bed frame until my knuckles went white and stayed there. She talked to me the whole time, not about what she was doing, just talking. About the cattle, about the fence line she needed to repair before the snow. About how the creek ran high in the spring and the east pasture flooded. Steady talk, like you'd use to calm a horse. She got it out. A piece of lead not much bigger than my thumbnail, but it had been sitting against a rib and that rib was cracked, and it was the crack that had been causing the pressure I'd been feeling. She held it up to the lamp and looked at it, and then she set it on the window ledge and went back to cleaning the wound like it was nothing. When she was done, she wrapped me tight, tight enough that the cracked rib was braced, and she said, "You'll need to lie still for at least 3 days, longer if the fever doesn't break." I said, "I can't stay 3 days." She said, "You can't leave either. Not yet, look at yourself." I looked at myself. She had a point. She brought me water and then broth, and I drank both without tasting either, and then she took the lamp and went to the door and she paused. She said, "James Cole." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is that your name?" A long moment. The lamp threw shadows up the wall. I said, "It's the name I've been using." She stood there, then she said, "All right, sleep. We'll talk when you wake up." She went out. I lay there in the dark listening to her move around the kitchen, and then the sounds quieted, and I closed my eyes, and I slept harder than I'd slept in over a year. I should tell you what I was running from. It'll take a minute, bear with me. 6 years before I showed up on Ruth Calloway's porch, I was a scout for the United States Army out of Fort Laramie. I'd been doing that work since I was 23. By the time we're talking about, I was 37 and I was good at it. Good enough to have a reputation. Good enough that when Colonel Hardin needed someone to guide a survey party through the Yellowstone country in the summer of '67, he asked for me by name. The survey party was 12 men, 2 officers, a cartographer named Aldous, and a chaplain who nobody had asked for but who'd come anyway. We were to map a route through the upper basin and return by fall. Simple enough. I'd done similar work a dozen times. What I hadn't done was that particular stretch of country in that particular year, with those particular men. I won't name the tribe, doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that we moved through their territory in a way that was not careful, and men who were not careful got men killed, and I knew it, and I said so, and I was not listened to. Not once. Not when I pointed out the signs. Not when I told Hardin that the way we'd made camp 2 nights running was wrong, visible from 3 ridges, noisy, careless. He was a colonel and I was a scout, and in his mind those were the only facts that mattered. On the 7th morning we were hit. Fast and hard and from 3 sides at once, the way people hit when they know what they're doing and the people they're hitting don't. Of the 14 of us, 7 died in the first 10 minutes, 3 more in the next hour. The chaplain died praying, which I suppose was the way he'd have wanted it. Aldous, both hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his horse, stayed close to me the whole fight, and I got him out. Got Hardin out too, God help me. Got the 2 of us and Aldous and 1 private named Gessner out of that basin and onto the plain and eventually back to the fort. The Army's version of what happened, written up by Colonel Hardin, said that my scouting had been deficient, that I had led the party into a dangerous position through inadequate reconnaissance, that the deaths of 7 men were attributable in part to my professional failure. I sat in front of a board of inquiry and I told the truth. Every sign I'd pointed out, every conversation, every time I'd said the camp was wrong and been ignored, Aldous backed me up, Gessner backed me up. The board listened very politely and then sustained Hardin's version. I walked out of that fort and I never went back. Aldous wrote to me twice after that. I never answered. There wasn't anything to say. For 3 years I drifted. Odd work. Guiding hunting parties, rich men from the east who wanted to shoot buffalo and go home and tell about it. A season punching cattle up from Texas, which I was mediocre at and didn't enjoy. A winter trapping in the Bitterroot with a man named Pierce who talked too much and didn't smell good and kept asking personal questions. It was that winter I started drinking in a way that wasn't just a habit. Not going to dress that up. I drank hard for about 18 months, lost most of what I'd saved, lost a horse to a card game I barely remember. Hit a man in a bar in Cheyenne, didn't know him. He'd said something. I don't even recall what hit him hard enough to break his jaw and 3 of my own knuckles. Spent 2 weeks in a jail cell staring at the ceiling. When they let me out, I stood in the street and I thought, this is what the rest of it looks like. This is what's left. I was 40 years old. I stopped drinking that day, just stopped. I won't pretend it was easy or clean. It wasn't, but I stopped. I went back to work. Real work this time. I hired on as a deputy in a small town called Mineral Creek up in Montana Territory for a sheriff named Dowd who was short on men and didn't ask too many questions. I was good at it, better than I'd expected. The drinking had taken things from me, but it had also, I don't know how to put this, it had burned off the parts of me that got tangled up in things that weren't my business. What was left was quieter, harder to rattle. I did 2 years in Mineral Creek, kept the peace, didn't drink, sent some money to Aldous, who I'd heard had fallen on hard times, didn't sign the letters. Then a man named Broussard came to town. Broussard had been running a freight operation between Mineral Creek and the mining camps to the east. He had 4 men working for him, and he had a contract with the territorial government, and he had, it turned out, a secondary operation that involved none of those things, a business of moving stolen horses across the border into Canada. I found out about it by accident. Wrong place, wrong time. I saw what I saw. I went to Sheriff Dowd. Dowd told me to let it alone. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. I'd learned enough in 2 years to know that some arrangements in Mineral Creek were older than I was. I did not let it alone. I arrested one of Broussard's men, a wiry little sadist named Fitch, on a separate charge. He'd beaten a Mateys trapper badly enough to put him in bed for a week. And while Fitch was in the cell, I talked to him, and he talked back, and I got enough to go to the territorial marshal's office directly, over Dowd's head. What followed was complicated. The short version is, Broussard found out I'd gone to the marshal. Broussard had more connections than I'd understood. The marshal's office was slower to move than I'd hoped. And one evening when I was riding back from the eastern boundary of town, two of Broussard's men came at me out of the dark, and one of them put a bullet in my side, and I killed him and the other one ran, and I got on my horse and I rode. I rode because Fitch was still in the cell and Dowd's version of events, whatever it was going to be written before mine, and I'd been through that before, and I wasn't going to sit in front of another board of inquiry with another colonel's report on the table. I wasn't going to do that again. I became James Cole. I rode south and east, and 3 days later, before dawn on a cold October morning, I knocked on a widow's door. The fever broke on the second day. I know it broke because I woke up soaking wet and clearer than I'd been in what felt like a long time, and Ruth Calloway was sitting in the wooden chair in the corner of the room, asleep. She was still dressed. The lamp had burned low. Through the east window I could see that the sky was just barely starting to lighten. She'd been sitting up with me, through the night. I don't know what the night had been like, whether I'd said things, done things, whatever the fever brings up when a man is in it, but she'd been there. That much was plain. I lay there and I looked at her. Asleep she looked younger and also, I'm not sure how to put this, more tired. Like the waking up face she wore for the world was work she did, the set of it, the clear-eyed steadiness. What was underneath when the work stopped was somebody who was exhausted and had been exhausted for a long time. I thought about my mother, which I hadn't done in years. I thought about my mother after my father died, how she just kept going, like she was made of a different material than grief. I didn't want to wake Ruth, but I was thirsty enough that I had to try to reach the water on the stand, and I moved wrong and made a sound, and she was awake immediately. Not slow and bleary the way most people wake, just awake. She said, "The fever." I said, "I think it broke." She put her hand on my forehead. She did it matter-of-factly, the way you'd check a flue pipe, just a piece of information she needed. But her hand was warm and it stayed there for a moment, and I closed my eyes, and I was 43 years old and I felt like I was about 12. She said, "Yes, it's broken." She got up and went to get fresh water, and I lay there with the feeling of her hand on my forehead, already gone, and I thought about what I was going to tell her. She gave me 3 days before she asked. Not pointedly, not with suspicion. Just practically, on the morning of the 3rd day, when I was sitting up and eating real food and clearly going to live, she sat down across the small table from me, and she put her hands flat on it and she said, "You don't have to tell me, but I'd like to know who I've got in my house." There was no threat in it, no accusation. It was just an honest question from a woman who'd spent 3 nights watching over a stranger and felt she'd earned a straight answer, which she had. I told her all of it. The board of inquiry, the 3 years drifting, the drinking, Mineral Creek, Broussard, the 2 men in the dark, the bullet, the riding south. I left nothing out that I can recall. I sat there at her kitchen table, and I told her the whole of it in a voice that didn't shake, which surprised me, because I hadn't said any of this out loud before to anyone. She listened. She didn't interrupt except twice, once to refill my coffee, once to ask a clarifying question about the geography. She wanted to understand where Mineral Creek was in relation to where we were. I think she was thinking about whether Broussard's reach extended this far south. Practical. That was her mind. When I was done, she sat there for a moment. Then she said, "Cal Devereaux." First time she'd used my real name. I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want to do?" And I realized it hadn't occurred to me, I'd been too busy surviving, that she wasn't asking whether I was going to leave. She was asking what I wanted, what my plan was, what I was working toward, like it was a question with an actual answer that she was prepared to help me think through. I said, I don't rightly know. I've been trying to stay ahead of it. She said, that's not a plan. I said, no, it's not. She said, you've got a cracked rib and you can't ride hard for at least 2 more weeks. And even if you could, where are you going? I said, hadn't thought past that. She said, the territorial marshal's office. You need to get your account in before Dowd's version hardens. You said you sent information directly to the marshal already. That means there's a record of it. That's something. A lawyer in Cheyenne could take what you have and do something with it if it's good material. I looked at her. She said, Thomas, my husband, he spent 3 years fighting a boundary claim with the land office. I learned a fair amount about how paper moves. You'd be surprised what sticks when you get it documented properly. I said, you've been thinking about this. She said, I had a lot of hours while you were feverish. Something happened in my chest that I'm not going to try to name. I'll just say it had been a long time since anybody had spent their hours thinking about my situation. A long time since anybody had looked at my mess and seen a set of problems that might be solvable instead of just evidence of a ruined man. I said, why would you do that? She looked at me for a moment like it was a strange question. Then she said, because you told me the truth when you didn't have to, and because the truth sounds true. She let me work the place while I healed. That was her way, not here rest, take it easy. More like, the east fence needs mending when you feel up to it. The cattle need to be moved to the south pasture before the next cold comes. The barn door is hanging wrong and I haven't had the height for it. She said it like she was giving me a list of things to think about. I took it for what it was. I was not a cattle man, as I said, but I knew horses and I knew tools and I knew how to work, and I'd spent enough time in enough different places to know most of the basics. I mended the fence. I moved the cattle. I fixed the barn door, which turned out to be a matter of a hinge and a half hour, and she stood at the barn entrance and watched me do it and said nothing, but I felt her watching and I worked clean. The days had a rhythm. She was up before me every morning. I was still slow. The rib needed time, and by the time I came in for breakfast the stove was hot and the coffee was done. We'd eat mostly in silence, comfortable silence, the kind that comes when 2 people have already said the important things and don't need to fill the air. She'd lay out what needed doing. I'd do it. Evenings she'd read. She had a surprising number of books for a frontier ranch, and she read seriously, not for diversion, and I'd sit and sometimes talk and sometimes not. On the 5th night she asked me about the survey, the one in '67. Asked me to tell it plain, not the report version, just what happened. I told it. She listened the same way she listened to everything, quiet, complete attention, not performing listening but actually doing it. When I was done she said, 7 men. I said, yes. She said, and you've been carrying that. I said, not so much the deaths, the hearing, the way it was written. She said, the way your word was set aside. I said, yes. She looked at me for a while. Then she said, my father was a surveyor. Government work, same era, different territory. He had a similar situation, his word against an officer's and the officer's version one. He never talked about it, but it was in him until he died. I recognized it in you the first morning. I said, recognized what? She said, the way a man looks when he's decided he doesn't matter much anymore. I sat with that. She said, you matter, Cal, for what it's worth, from where I'm sitting. 4 words, from where I'm sitting. I've turned those over more times than I could count. 2 weeks in, she asked me if I'd stay through the winter. She said it plainly. No pretense about it being only practical, but no drama either. She needed help with the ranch, that was true and real, and a legitimate reason all by itself. But she also said, I have not had a person in this house worth talking to in 3 years, and I find that I would like to keep talking to you. I told her I needed to go to Cheyenne first, deal with Broussard and the marshal's office, get my name clean, or as clean as it was going to get. I wasn't willing to be a man living under another man's accusation if I had a way to fight it, and I thought I might have a way to fight it. She said, I know, I'm asking about after. I said, after I go to Cheyenne. She said, after you go to Cheyenne and come back. That word, come back. She said it like it was already decided, like the question was just one of timing. And maybe that steadiness she put into it was intentional, a way of saying without saying, I believe you'll make it through. I believe there's something on the other side. I believe you are worth coming back to. Or maybe I'm reading too much in. Wouldn't be the first time a man found meaning in a woman's words that she didn't intend. But I don't think so. Not with Ruth. She said what she meant. I said, I'll come back. She looked at me, then she nodded once. That was her version of shaking on it. I left on a Monday. She'd given me a good horse, a roan mare named Pella, stout and steady, better than anything I'd ridden in years, and she'd put up food for the road, and she'd written 2 letters. One to her lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Sutherland whom she said was honest and direct, and one to a woman she knew at the territorial marshal's office, a clerk named Agnes who had been Ruth's neighbor years back before Agnes moved to the city, and who, according to Ruth, knew more about what paperwork was in that office than anybody with a title did. She stood on the porch while I saddled up. She hadn't come close, wasn't going to make a scene of it. That wasn't her way. But when I turned and looked at her, standing straight, one hand on the porch post, the early light on her face, I thought, this is a woman who built something out of what was left after the thing she built fell down. And she did it alone. And she is still standing there doing it. I said, Ruth. She said, Cal. I said, I'll be back in 3 weeks, maybe 4. She said, I'll be here. That was all. I rode out. I didn't look back, which cost me something. Cheyenne was 40 miles and 2 days' ride. Sutherland turned out to be a small man with a large desk and a way of listening that reminded me of Ruth, complete attention, nothing wasted. He read what I brought him, asked his questions, read it again. Then he said, it's workable, not clean but workable. You have the correspondence with the marshal's office, you have the timeline, and you have the fact that 2 of Broussard's men are accounted for, 1 dead by your hand in self-defense, 1 fled and presumably still findable. That's enough to move the picture. Agnes at the marshal's office was everything Ruth had said she was. Small and sharp-eyed and unimpressed by anything, she pulled files for Sutherland in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Broussard's operation, it turned out, had been under interest from the marshal's office for almost a year. Dowd's protective role was not unknown. What they'd been lacking was a direct witness account from someone with standing, someone who'd seen the operation firsthand and hadn't been paid off. That was me. I gave my account, 3 times to 3 different people, each time in writing. It took the better part of a week. Sutherland sat with me through all of it, and when I said anything that could have been phrased better, he said so, and I rephrased it. By the end of the week, the marshal's office had enough to move on Broussard, and had enough to clear my name of the charges Dowd had put to paper. Dowd himself was under a separate investigation by that point. Agnes had been building that file quietly for months, and his version of what happened the night I was shot was going to get a very close look. It wasn't done. It was going to take months to fully resolve, but Sutherland said what I needed to hear: you can go home. The record knows where to find you. Home. I rode back to Ruth's ranch on a Friday, late afternoon, the sun low behind me and the shadows long across the plain. I came up the road and I saw the lamp in the window, that same one that had been there the morning I'd arrived, yellow and steady. She was in the pasture when I came through the gate, moving one of the yearlings that had gotten to the wrong side of the fence, which she was doing by herself with a long stick and more patience than the yearling deserved. She heard the horse and she turned and she looked at me. I sat on Pella and she stood in the pasture, and we looked at each other across about 40 yards of grass in the late light. She said, 3 weeks and 2 days. I said, I told you maybe 4. She almost smiled. Did smile actually this time, not the almost. The real one. It changed her face in a way I hadn't seen before, opened something in it, and it hit me somewhere low in my chest in a way I was not prepared for. She said, go put the horse up, I'll finish here. I put the horse up. That night we sat at the kitchen table later than usual. She'd cooked a real meal. She didn't bother much when it was only herself. She told me, but she'd made a beef stew that had been going all day, and there was bread, and it was the best thing I'd eaten since I couldn't remember when. We talked for a long time about Cheyenne, about Sutherland, about Agnes and the files. She asked good questions. She was satisfied with what I told her. After a while the talk quieted, and we just sat. The lamp was low and the fire was down to coals, and the wind had come up outside, the kind of October wind that means business, rattling the windows. She said, I thought about you. I said, I thought about you too. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, looking at the table, Thomas was a good man, a good husband. I grieved him properly, and I don't begrudge the years we had. But he wasn't, we weren't. I mean to say that there are kinds of talking that Thomas and I didn't do. The kind of talking you and I do. She looked up then. She said, you're not what I expected. When I opened the door that morning, wounded and lying to me about your name. I said, no, I don't suppose I was. She said, you're more than you think you are, Cal. You've spent a long time being less than you are. I'd like it if you stopped that. I sat there. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not grasping, just set it there. Warm and steady, the way she did everything. She said, I'd like you to stay, not through the winter, after the winter. I'm saying that plainly so there's no confusion. I turned my hand over under hers and I held it. Old, scarred hand, calluses on the inside of my thumb and the base of my palm, knuckles that had been broken and healed crooked. And her hand, rough from work, strong, fitting against mine like it knew where it was going. I said, yes. She nodded, that was it, that was the whole thing. I'm going to tell you about the morning she found the letter. This was 2 months later, December, snow already on the ground, the ranch locked down for winter, the two of us in a rhythm so solid by then it felt like it had always been there. The letter was from Sutherland. It said that the investigation into Browsard had produced results, 3 arrests, seizure of assets, and a formal exoneration of my account regarding the events of October, the night I was shot. He also said that Dowd had resigned from his position in Mineral Creek in advance of a formal hearing, and that the new sheriff there had reached out to ask if I'd consider returning to my role as deputy. Ruth found me at the kitchen table reading it. She poured her coffee and sat down and said, "What is it?" I handed it to her without saying anything. She read it again. Then she set it down on the table and looked at me. She said, "Mineral Creek." I said, "He's asking if I'd consider it." She said, "What are you considering?" I looked at her. She was looking back at me with that level look. She had no pleading, no pressure, just a clear-eyed woman waiting to hear what a man had to say. I said, "I'm not considering it." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sitting in the right kitchen. I know what I've got." She looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and she said, "The east pasture gate is hanging again. Same hinge." I said, "I'll get to it." She said, "I know you will." There's a photograph. One of the traveling kind daguerreotype man came through in the spring of '74, stopping at ranches and towns along the route, and Ruth paid him the $1.50 to take our picture. It's on the mantelpiece now. We're standing on the porch. I'm in a clean shirt, first time I'd had my picture taken since I was in the army. She's standing beside me, not in front, not behind, beside, and she's got one hand tucked through my arm. I don't look like a man who's wound down. I don't look finished. I look like a man who is where he's supposed to be. Whatever that reads like on a face, that's what's there. She chose that. She looked at the mess of me and she decided it was worth the work. Not out of charity. Ruth Calloway didn't do anything out of charity. That wasn't how she was built. She did it because she saw something and she trusted what she saw. I knocked on her door that morning, broken in about 6 ways. I'd stopped counting. She opened it. That's the whole story. The rest is just the rest of my life, which turned out to be longer and better than I had any right to expect. I'll take it.